We inherit an image of ancient Greece that glitters like polished marble, a place of theater and rhetoric and reasoned debate. Yet, if you follow the sound of sandals past the colonnades and into the service corridors, you encounter a different story. One carefully excluded from the triumphal narratives, a story of bodies bought and sold, of children inspected like livestock, of laughter in the dining room that curdles in the ears of those kept in the shadows. Behind the polished words of philosophy and the public rituals of democracy lay ledgers that list not only amphorae of oil and sacks of grain, but also boys with bright eyes and steady hands, priced in silver with the same casual ink. The celebrated ideals of freedom and civic equality were anchored to households where law stopped at the threshold and another order began, an order in which the rules of virtue did not apply. The cruelty here was not the spectacle of blood sport, but the banality of routine. A system that cleaned and oiled human merchandise before presenting them as servers, entertainers, or ornaments, their bodies made to gleam so that the household shone with refinement. The paradox is etched into every record. The leisure that nurtured philosophical inquiry and political invention depended on lives erased from the civic narrative, their dignity dissolved into service. Contracts and receipts reveal how a poor harvest translated directly into the loss of a son, how creditors converted desperation into years of bondage, how merchants set up their stalls with chains coiled neatly beside scales for weighing silver. These transactions rarely carried the tone of scandal. They were recorded with the same precision as a shipment of figs. The city that praised proportion and moderation perfected the compartmentalization of morality, permitting equality in the square while enforcing hierarchy in the home. And the same men who spoke eloquently about justice appraised shoulders, teeth, and temperament as if assessing pottery for cracks. Surviving fragments of household accounts tell of boys renamed for convenience, stripped of their languages and memories, reshaped to fit the aesthetic of their master's world. What emerges from these sources is not a vision of monsters, but of administrators who combined culture and cruelty in a single rhythm, men who could recite poetry while noting the endurance of their servants, who praised moderation by day and indulged in excess by night without perceiving contradiction. The marvels of Greek thought remain luminous, yet their brilliance falls across floors, scrubbed by anonymous hands and banquet tables laid by those whose names were never recorded. In the smallest verbs of command lies the grammar of domination, a language that trained bodies to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to erase themselves in order to sustain the lives of others. The uncomfortable truth is that greatness and brutality were not opposites in this world, but companions sharing the same roof, and that the price of one was so often the obliteration of the other. If you listen carefully, the silence of the records begins to hum with the weight of the unacknowledged, with the sighs of children who became property, with the rhythm of chains that kept democracy possible for those who were allowed to vote. The marble columns and painted frescoes dazzled contemporaries and continue to awe us, but every stone of those structures also echoes with invisible lives that held them up. To confront this reality is not to diminish Greek achievements, but to widen our gaze, to see how a civilization carried itself on the shoulders of the forgotten. The hidden rooms, the back corridors, the market stalls filled with trembling youths are as much a part of Greek history as the tragedies of Sophocles or the dialogues of Plato. And if we allow ourselves to see this whole picture, the story becomes richer and more unsettling, a reminder that culture and cruelty can grow from the same soil, and that the pursuit of beauty and knowledge often concealed the calculated erasure of countless human lives. In the Greek world, enslavement was not only the consequence of conquest, but also a response to the fragile economics of rural life, where families lived at the mercy of harvests, weather, and debt. A single year of drought could destroy the olive and barley crops that sustained an entire village, leaving households unable to repay loans taken from wealthy landowners or merchants. When creditors arrived, repayment was rarely demanded in abstract promises or in kind. It was demanded in flesh, and children were often the most negotiable form of collateral. Fathers who could no longer feed their families found themselves bargaining with the futures of their sons, accepting contracts of 20 years' service, or outright sale, in exchange for a handful of silver coins that would carry the household through winter. The arithmetic was brutal but convincing. One child's absence ensured the survival of the others. The records of the period reveal a marketplace that treated human beings like commodities, with the same categories of quality, endurance, and appeal that might be applied to livestock or land. Merchants traveled the countryside, their arrival greeted with both dread and desperate hope, offering immediate relief for long-term bondage. This system was not hidden or peripheral. It was an accepted part of the social and economic order, a pressure valve that allowed elites to stabilize their wealth and peasants to postpone starvation. Beyond debt, war and raiding also supplied bodies to the slave markets, but even these were tied to economics, as armies sought plunder not only in gold but in labor. A captured village meant both immediate ransom and a steady flow of young men and women into households that demanded constant replacement of servants. Beauty itself became a commodity, as attractive youths could fetch higher prices than strong laborers, their value determined not by their ability to till fields, but by their capacity to adorn the private lives of the wealthy. This commodification of human life reveals a society where vulnerability itself was a form of currency, where the misfortune of a failed harvest or an injury in the family could be instantly transformed into a transfer of flesh. The cycle was relentless. Poor families slid into debt, debt produced slaves, and slaves reinforced the prosperity of those at the top, whose leisure allowed them to cultivate the very arts and philosophies for which Greece is remembered. Even promises of future return, that children would one day come back with wealth and status, were part of this mechanism, sweet illusions, masking the permanence of loss. The villagers may have told themselves that servitude was temporary, but contracts and sales recorded in ledgers rarely allowed for reunion. Instead, the silver coins gleamed in the sunlight as silent witnesses to the exchange, each one representing not only sustenance for the present, but also years of erased possibility. In this way, the economy of survival became indistinguishable from the economy of bondage, and the structures of debt, agriculture, and commerce ensured a steady stream of human lives into the markets of Athens and beyond. Slave trading in the Greek world functioned as a business with its own infrastructure, routines, and professional actors, and it operated with a degree of efficiency that reveals how deeply embedded it was in the economic life of the cities. The market in Athens was not simply a place for grain, wine, or pottery. It was also a stage where human beings were arranged, evaluated, and sold under the same principles of supply and demand that governed other commodities. Merchants brought their captives from rural villages struck by debt, from coastal raids, or from wars between rival city-states, and they moved them in caravans bound by chains, a mobile inventory designed to feed the constant demand of urban households. Once in the city, the process was ritualized. Captives were cleaned, oiled, and displayed in rows, their bodies made to appear more valuable through cosmetic presentation, because buyers paid attention not only to strength, but also to appearance, compliance, and youth. Buyers walked among the groups with ledgers in hand, prodding muscles, examining teeth, and asking questions about origin or temperament, much as they might assess livestock before a purchase. The market atmosphere mixed the cries of sellers, the bargaining of buyers, and the muffled voices of the enslaved, a blend of noise that created a rhythm recognizable as commercial life. For many traders, this was a profession passed through families, with networks that stretched from small villages to the great ports of the Aegean, ensuring that supply was constant. Prices fluctuated according to age, beauty, and skill, and auctioneers advertised the qualities of their merchandise with practiced exaggeration, turning human suffering into sales pitches. Certain categories of slaves were valued for agricultural work, others for domestic service, and some for their attractiveness to elite buyers, and these divisions were clearly reflected in pricing and positioning at the market stalls. Payment was usually made in silver, counted openly in front of the captives' families if they were present, each coin marking years of bondage with a metallic glint that sealed the transaction. The business extended beyond the initial sale, since contracts of long-term service could be negotiated, offering the illusion of temporary labor while in reality binding the individual for decades. Traders kept detailed records, not out of sentiment, but to track ownership, origin, and resale value, creating an archive of lives reduced to columns of figures and brief notes about health or potential. The efficiency of this trade depended on its normalization. It was not perceived as a scandal, but as a necessary component of economic stability, as ordinary as the sale of oil or timber. The presence of so many merchants ensured competition, and this competition drove the refinement of techniques for maximizing profit, from grooming slaves to staging auctions with drama that heightened bidding. In this way, slavery in Greece was not an incidental byproduct of war or poverty, but a carefully maintained system of commerce, and the market itself stood as a visible reminder that the prosperity of free citizens rested on the transformation of vulnerable lives into a business transaction. The Greek elite prided themselves on cultivating a public image of refinement, moderation, and virtue. Yet the evidence shows a striking duality in which the same men who extolled justice and equality in the assembly or wrote treatises on ethics behaved very differently within the walls of their private households. Publicly, they presented themselves as champions of democracy, as patrons of the arts, and as guardians of civic values, while privately they oversaw systems of servitude that treated human beings as expendable property. Philosophers debated the nature of virtue, arguing whether it could be taught or whether it was innate, but many of those same philosophers accepted without hesitation the idea that slaves occupied an entirely separate moral category, one in which principles of justice did not apply. Politicians delivered eloquent speeches about the dignity of the citizen body, but their households relied on the invisible labor of others, and their wealth was measured not only in land and silver, but also in the number of slaves they possessed. Poets praised beauty and the harmony of human existence, yet their verses often masked a reality in which the beauty of enslaved youths was purchased, displayed, and consumed as a private luxury. This dissonance was not accidental or hidden. It was a structural feature of society, carefully maintained through cultural norms that allowed men to compartmentalize their public ideals and their private appetites. The same man who sponsored a tragic play exploring themes of fate and justice could later recline at a symposium where slaves were humiliated for entertainment, and neither he nor his peers perceived contradiction. In their world, citizenship was the boundary of morality, and those beyond it were subject to use without ethical consequence. This compartmentalization allowed intellectual brilliance to coexist with systemic cruelty, as the cultivation of philosophy, politics, and art was supported by the exploitation of human beings whose suffering was deliberately excluded from civic discourse. Household records, legal contracts, and scattered testimonies reveal this dual life, in which moments of cultural achievement were made possible by the labor and degradation of others. The elites themselves rationalized the arrangement by claiming that some people were naturally suited to slavery, or that servitude provided discipline and order, arguments that gave a veneer of legitimacy to practices that contradicted the very principles they proclaimed in public. This dual morality extended even to religion, where the same elites who led rituals honoring the gods also ignored the suffering inflicted in their own households confident that divine favor was compatible with private exploitation. The society admired for its intellectual achievements, thus rested on a moral blindness that was not accidental ignorance, but an accepted division of thought and behavior. The Greek elite managed to sustain their reputations as paragons of virtue, while simultaneously maintaining systems that dehumanized countless individuals, and this paradox forms one of the most striking features of their civilization, a reminder that the brilliance of their public ideals was inseparable from the shadows in which those ideals were contradicted. The methods of psychological control used against slaves in ancient Greece were as deliberate and systematic as the physical punishments, and they reveal how deeply the system relied not only on chains, but on the reshaping of identity and thought. Isolation was one of the most effective tools, as individuals were removed from their families and villages, stripped of the bonds that gave them a sense of belonging, and placed among strangers who were equally powerless, ensuring that memory itself became fragile. Names were often changed, with new Greek names imposed to erase native languages and cultural markers, and the prohibition of speaking one's original tongue further accelerated the erosion of identity. Religion and custom were also targeted, since participation in household rituals of the master required the abandonment of ancestral practices, forcing enslaved people to enact loyalty to gods and traditions that were not their own. The unpredictability of punishment added another layer of control, because slaves could never anticipate whether a minor mistake would be ignored or met with harsh discipline, creating a constant atmosphere of fear, in which obedience was the only logical response. Rewards were carefully rationed to reinforce compliance, with better food, clothing, or the smallest privileges given only to those who submitted fully, teaching slaves to associate survival with surrender. Overseers cultivated this manipulation with precision, alternating cruelty with occasional leniency, so that gratitude itself became a tool of domination, making the enslaved thank their oppressors for withholding violence. The gradual internalization of this system was perhaps the most devastating method of all, because it taught individuals to police their own thoughts and behaviors without the need for constant external force. A bowed head, lowered eyes, and careful silence became habits so ingrained that they were difficult to abandon even in moments of safety. The destruction of personal history meant that many came to believe resistance was futile, as the language, customs, and relationships that might have sustained defiance were systematically erased. In households, new arrivals were often placed under the authority of slaves who had already been broken, ensuring that the methods of subjugation were passed along horizontally as well as vertically, deepening the cycle of control. The atmosphere of chronic uncertainty, where each day might bring a summons for service, punishment, or degradation, wore down resilience more effectively than open violence, creating a psychological exhaustion that left little room for rebellion. Even memory was weaponized, because as months and years passed, the ability to recall faces of parents or the sound of a native village faded, leaving individuals with nothing to hold on to except the present structure of domination. This was not incidental, but central to the institution, since the maintenance of slavery required more than physical possession of the body. It required the breaking and remaking of the mind so that obedience seemed natural and resistance unthinkable. The methods of psychological suppression thus became invisible chains, binding people through fear, confusion, and the slow erosion of self, ensuring that the system could continue with less reliance on open brutality and more on the quiet, insidious conquest of the human spirit. The system of slavery in ancient Greece was not a flat structure of uniform suffering, but a carefully layered hierarchy in which each position carried different expectations, privileges, and risks, and this stratification served to strengthen control by encouraging competition among the enslaved. At the bottom of the order were the newly captured or purchased individuals, those whose spirits were unbroken and whose unfamiliarity with their masters made them the most vulnerable to violent punishments. These newcomers were often subjected to the harshest treatment as a way of forcing submission quickly, and they were tested for endurance in the fields, kitchens, or within the household. Above them were those who had survived the first months or years and had accepted, either outwardly or inwardly, the routines imposed on them. These slaves might be granted slightly better food, more predictable schedules, or tasks considered less degrading, and their relative privileges marked them as models of obedience. Some were elevated to positions of authority within the household, serving as overseers or intermediaries who enforced rules on others, a role that offered security from the worst abuses, but often required betraying their fellow slaves. This practice divided the enslaved community, turning survival into a personal competition where loyalty to the master outweighed solidarity with peers. Within domestic service itself, there were layers, as those considered attractive or compliant enough to serve at the table or accompany the master enjoyed better clothing and shelter compared to those relegated to hard labor in fields, quarries, or workshops. Household slaves could sometimes acquire skills, cooking, accounting, craftsmanship that increased their value and gave them leverage, though these skills rarely translated into true autonomy. The rarest promotions went to personal attendants who were constantly in the presence of the master or his family, absorbing not only their commands but their moods and confidences, living close to luxury but under relentless scrutiny. Women and children within this hierarchy faced additional distinctions, with some assigned to household chores, while others were exploited for different purposes. Their placement dictated less by ability than by the whims of owners. This layered system was designed with ruthless efficiency, since by distributing privileges unequally, the masters prevented a unified resistance and ensured that many slaves invested their hopes in small advantages rather than collective action. Even in the mines, where conditions were uniformly deadly, overseers appointed from among the enslaved enforced the labor of others, showing that the hierarchy extended even into the bleakest environments. The promise of moving upward in this order was rarely fulfilled in a way that offered true escape, yet the illusion of advancement encouraged compliance. The psychological effect was profound, for each level of the hierarchy fostered a sense of superiority over those below and dependency on those above, a vertical chain of command that bound the enslaved as effectively as iron shackles. Records, anecdotes, and archaeological evidence reveal that this structure was not accidental but a deliberate feature of Greek slavery, carefully maintained to fragment solidarity and to transform survival itself into a form of competition. In this way, hierarchy became not only a means of organizing labor, but also an invisible mechanism of control, ensuring that the enslaved policed one another and internalized their place within a system designed to keep them divided, compliant, and endlessly useful to their masters. The symposium in ancient Greece was celebrated as a pinnacle of cultural life, a gathering where men of status reclined on couches to drink wine, exchange ideas, and enjoy music, poetry, and conversation. Yet, beneath this polished image lay a darker reality, in which the same setting that fostered intellectual brilliance also enabled exploitation and abuse. The room itself was carefully arranged, with couches placed around the central space, vessels of wine mixed with water, and slaves circulating to keep the rhythm of the evening unbroken. And while the participants engaged in lofty debates about virtue, politics, and philosophy, the presence of those who served them revealed the stark inequality that underpinned the entire event. Slaves were expected to remain silent and invisible unless commanded, pouring wine, preparing food, playing instruments, or entertaining guests with dance and song, and their bodies, no less than their labor, were considered part of the available resources of the evening. As the wine loosened tongues and eroded restraint, the discussions often shifted from the intellectual to the indulgent, and the slaves who had seemed marginal became the focus of attention, pressed into service that stripped them of dignity. Contemporary sources describe symposia as moments of creativity and fellowship. Yet archaeology and scattered testimonies suggest that these evenings also carried an atmosphere of menace for those without freedom, as the power of the guests extended into every corner of the room. The very men who spoke of justice and the good life by day could sanction humiliation and cruelty by night, and the structure of the symposium encouraged this duality by merging cultural refinement with the unchecked license of intoxication. Music, poetry, and philosophical dialogue were not abandoned, but rather intertwined with gestures of dominance, creating a dissonant environment where beauty and brutality coexisted. The expectation that slaves provide not only wine and food but also intimate services blurred the line between cultural ritual and personal indulgence, and the acceptance of this arrangement shows how normalized exploitation had become. The atmosphere of competition among the elite, in which wit, generosity, or daring acts earned admiration, often spilled over into the treatment of those serving, as guests sought to impress one another by demonstrating power or creativity at the expense of their subordinates. This environment made resistance nearly impossible, for silence and obedience were the only protections, and even these were fragile. The symposium thus functioned as a microcosm of Greek society, displaying its intellectual sophistication on the surface while revealing the hidden dependence on those whose humanity was denied. The coexistence of high culture and low cruelty was not seen as contradiction, but as natural, a reflection of a worldview that placed citizens and slaves in entirely separate categories of moral concern. The beauty of recited poetry, the elegance of philosophical debate, and the harmony of music were all enriched by the labor and presence of the unfree, yet their suffering was excluded from the record, leaving us with a legacy of texts that praise the brilliance of the symposium while remaining silent about the pain embedded in its rituals. Survival within the structures of Greek slavery often demanded not physical strength alone, but the gradual surrender of one's sense of self, a transformation in which individuals learn to exist by erasing the very qualities that once defined them. The process began with the stripping away of names, languages, and customs, leaving captives unable to anchor themselves to the past, and it continued with the imposition of routines that demanded complete obedience to external authority. Over time, many discovered that the only way to endure daily humiliation was to distance their minds from their bodies, to create a division between the inner self that remembered freedom and the outer self that performed compliance. This mental retreat allowed a slave to pour wine, endure abuse, or accept commands without breaking entirely, but the price of such detachment was the slow fading of individuality, the laughter of childhood, the memory of family. Even the rhythm of native speech became dangerous luxuries, for clinging to them invited despair, while forgetting them created a numbness that made survival possible. Overseers and masters recognized this adaptation and even encouraged it, rewarding those who appeared most compliant and punishing visible resistance, thereby reinforcing the lesson that to live one must submit completely. For some, this meant internalizing the gestures of servility, lowered eyes, careful silence, predictable obedience, until these no longer felt like performances but habits, woven into the fabric of their being. The paradox was clear. By ceasing to resist inwardly, by becoming in appearance the perfect servant, one might avoid punishments, gain small privileges, and extend the span of life. Yet each concession deepened the loss of dignity and eroded the fragments of identity that once offered comfort. Ancient testimonies describe slaves who became almost ghost-like, present in body but absent in spirit, shadows of people who had learned to survive by vanishing into their roles. Others noted that those who endured long enough in a household often adopted the posture and speech of their masters, mimicking patterns of thought and behavior, until it was difficult even for themselves to recall who they had once been. The survival that resulted from this erasure was real in the sense that life continued, but it was also hollow because it required the suppression of the very humanity that gave life meaning. Some scholars argue that this phenomenon created a form of living death in which the enslaved body functioned while the inner self retreated so far into silence that it could no longer return. Yet within this bleak reality lay a grim logic, for the system thrived not only on forced labor but on the transformation of people into compliant instruments, and the mechanism by which this was achieved was the destruction of personality. The endurance of slaves was thus marked not by triumph over oppression, but by adaptation to it, a survival bought at the cost of identity, a life prolonged through the surrender of selfhood. Resistance among slaves in ancient Greece did not always take the form of open revolt or dramatic escape, but often appeared in subtle, quiet gestures that preserved fragments of dignity and humanity within a system designed to erase them. In households where direct defiance brought swift punishment, enslaved people developed hidden languages of looks, small signs, and whispered words exchanged when overseers turned away, creating micro-communities of solidarity that gave them strength to endure. They passed down stories of their homelands, recounting names of rivers, mountains, and ancestors, thereby keeping alive a sense of belonging that masters sought to destroy, and in doing so they turned memory itself into an act of resistance. Artifacts suggest that slaves crafted small objects from scraps of wood, bone, or clay, objects with no practical purpose other than to embody creativity and individuality, tokens hidden in walls or buried in courtyards that declared silently that their makers were more than property. Songs hummed under the breath, poems whispered in foreign tongues, and prayers to ancestral gods maintained a spiritual continuity that the imposed rituals of the master could not fully erase. Even the act of teaching another enslaved child a forbidden word of their native language was an assertion of identity, a refusal to allow complete assimilation. Sharing food, protecting the weak, or tending secretly to the sick were all practices that defied the logic of a system that encouraged selfish compliance. And these small acts of care reinforced the idea that community survived even in captivity. Occasionally, resistance took the form of deliberate incompetence, of slowing the pace of work, of breaking tools in ways that seemed accidental, a strategy that disrupted productivity without exposing the perpetrator to certain retribution. Masters often sought to divide their servants through hierarchy and reward, but many slaves found ways to navigate these divisions, offering warnings of impending punishments or concealing the mistakes of others, gestures that created a fragile web of protection. The very act of remembering names of those who had died, of recounting how they lived and how they suffered, became a means of denying the erasure intended by the system, ensuring that lives did not vanish unmarked. These forms of resistance rarely altered the structure of slavery, yet they sustained the inner lives of the oppressed, preserving hope, memory, and a sense of self-worth that the masters could never fully extinguish. They represent a defiance not in the form of weapons or rebellion, but in the determination to remain human in the face of dehumanization. Such actions, invisible in most historical records, survive in fragments of testimony and in the recognition that endurance itself can be a kind of opposition, that surviving without surrendering entirely to the role imposed was an achievement of remarkable strength. Through whispered stories, hidden crafts, shared glances, and the preservation of memory, slaves carved out spaces of humanity in an environment that denied it, and these subtle acts stand as enduring evidence that even in conditions of total domination, people found ways to resist, however quietly, and to affirm that their lives could not be reduced to to mere property. The structures of exploitation that underpinned slavery in ancient Greece find unsettling echoes in the modern world, where systems of power continue to transform human vulnerability into profit. And though the forms have changed, the logic remains familiar. In antiquity, debt, famine, or conquest delivered bodies to the slave market, while today, poverty, political instability, and global inequality drive families to decisions that expose their children to forced labor or trafficking. The Greek symposium, celebrated for intellectual debate but dependent on the silent service of the enslaved, mirrors the ways in which modern industries rely on invisible labor, from child workers harvesting crops to factory hands stitching garments for global markets, whose presence is erased from the glossy surfaces of consumer goods. Just as philosophers once compartmentalized their ideals, defending justice for citizens while excluding slaves from moral concern, so too do modern societies maintain legal and ethical frameworks that champion human rights, while tolerating exploitation hidden in supply chains or outsourced across borders. Ancient elites rationalized cruelty by claiming that some were naturally destined for servitude, while contemporary discourse often shifts blame onto the victims themselves, suggesting that poverty or migration reflects personal failure rather than structural injustice. The slave merchants of Athens, who treated youth, beauty, and skill as commodities, find their counterparts in traffickers who today exploit the same attributes, marketing human beings with chillingly similar language of promise and potential. Even the psychological tools of domination persist, for just as Greek masters used unpredictability and erasure of identity to break resistance, modern exploiters rely on isolation, misinformation, and control over documentation to ensure compliance. The contradictions of the classical world, where art and philosophy flourished alongside dehumanization, repeat in our own time as societies celebrate progress in technology, culture, and law, while overlooking the hidden suffering that sustains comfort and prosperity. The marble columns that concealed anguish in ancient households are reflected in the glass towers and digital platforms that obscure the exploitation embedded in global systems. The essential mechanism has not changed. Some people's pain is converted into others' pleasure or profit, and collective blindness allows it to continue. Even rhetoric follows familiar patterns. As then and now, intellectual sophistication provides justifications for inaction, whether in economic theory that normalizes cheap labor or in political debate that treats exploitation as an unfortunate but necessary cost of growth. The continuity reminds us that cruelty evolves not by vanishing, but by refinement, adopting new disguises while retaining its essence. What links the slave markets of Athens to the hidden workshops of today is the persistent ability of societies to separate ideals from practice, to create categories of people deemed outside the circle of moral concern. The story of antiquity is therefore not simply a distant narrative of past injustice, but a mirror that reflects our own systems, reminding us that progress is fragile and that without vigilance, we continue to reproduce the same structures of domination under different names. The end of a slave's life in ancient Greece often came not through sudden violence, but through the slow erosion of body and spirit. And in the story of one such individual, we glimpse the common pattern by which usefulness declined and death approached. After years of service in a wealthy household, years in which compliance and endurance brought only survival rather than freedom, the body bore scars of punishment and labor, joints weakened by strain, and lungs damaged by dust and smoke. When beauty faded and obedience ceased to carry economic value, the master no longer saw the individual as suitable for household roles and ordered him transferred to harsher labor in the mines. This shift was not presented as cruelty, but as a practical decision, a reallocation of resources in which a life was measured like any other commodity. The mines, however, were widely known as places of slow death, where slaves worked in narrow tunnels with poor air, constant risk of collapse, and impossible quotas designed to exhaust every fragment of strength before discarding the body. The journey from the city to the mountains offered fleeting reminders of the past, as familiar landscapes awakened memories of family and childhood, but these recollections were overshadowed by the certainty of what awaited. In the camp, hundreds of slaves labored in perpetual darkness, their coughs echoing through unstable shafts, their bodies covered in dust that poisoned lungs and shortened lives. Yet even here, a fragile community persisted. For slaves supported one another with shared food, whispered stories, and the preservation of names, creating an oral archive that ensured no life vanished entirely without memory. For this man, the years of broken compliance had numbed the spirit, yet before his end, he passed along a crude metal shard to others, a small tool hidden from overseers, symbolizing the possibility of choice in a system designed to erase choice altogether. This gesture reflected an understanding that though his own story was ending, others might continue, and survival might one day mean something more than compliance. His death arrived not in spectacle, but in silence. When his weakened lungs finally surrendered after repeated tunnel collapses and unending exposure to dust, companions buried him in memory rather than in stone, promising to speak his name in secret so that his existence was not erased by the indifference of his masters. His story, like those of countless others, did not enter official records, but survived in fragments, in the recognition that behind the wealth of Athens and the brilliance of its culture lay the steady consumption of human lives. The finality of his death was thus both an individual end and a symbol of the broader system in which slaves were cycled from household service to mines, from relative visibility to complete obscurity, until their bodies gave out. What remains is the reminder that the foundation of ancient prosperity rested on lives extinguished without ceremony, and that even in the bleakest circumstances, the smallest acts of remembrance and defiance carried meaning beyond the reach of power. The central message of examining slavery in ancient Greece lies in confronting the uncomfortable truth that the civilization celebrated for its philosophy, democracy, and art was sustained by the systematic exploitation and dehumanization of countless individuals, and that this contradiction was not hidden, but woven into the very fabric of society. The marble temples and theaters that still inspire awe were built on the labor of those who had no voice, and the symposiums remembered as sites of cultural refinement depended on the silent service of people reduced to property. Philosophers could debate justice, poets could praise beauty, and politicians could extol freedom, all while excluding slaves from their moral universe. And this compartmentalization reveals how intellectual achievement and cruelty can coexist without dissonance when society collectively agrees to look away. The lesson is not that Greek culture was uniquely hypocritical, but that human progress has often advanced by concealing the suffering of those who make it possible, and this pattern continues in modern forms of labor exploitation, trafficking, and economic inequality. By tracing the stories of the enslaved, their capture, their commodification, their survival strategies, and their quiet forms of resistance, we recover a dimension of history that official accounts preferred to forget, and in doing so, we expose the full cost of what we call civilization. The point is not to deny the brilliance of Greek achievements, but to place them in context, to see how beauty and brutality were partners rather than opposites. This understanding challenges us to question our own age, where rights and freedoms are praised, while hidden systems of exploitation persist behind supply chains, legal fictions, and economic abstractions. The moral blindness of antiquity, where elites could rationalize cruelty through arguments about natural hierarchy or necessity, finds echoes today in justifications for inequality framed in terms of efficiency, globalization, or cultural difference. The ultimate message is therefore twofold. First, that no culture's greatness can be understood without acknowledging the suffering it imposed. And second, that remembering the forgotten victims is itself a form of resistance against repetition. To recognize the humanity of those erased from official records is to dismantle the illusion that progress has ever been clean or pure. The lives of enslaved people in Greece were often brief and brutal, but their endurance, their whispered stories, and their small acts of defiance remind us that even in the darkest systems, humanity persists. By listening to those echoes, we not only restore balance to our view of the past, but also sharpen our vision of the present, understanding that exploitation, when hidden or ignored, continues to thrive. The main lesson is not simply historical but moral. That culture without conscience builds its monuments on human misery, and that every generation must decide whether to repeat that pattern or to break it.